What would you do if you met someone with the power to heal, yet they were condemned to die for a crime they didn't commit? This is a story about redemption, the power of kindness, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. Paul and other residents of a retirement home are watching TV when an old music video featuring Fred Astaire comes on. Paul is overtaken with emotion and walks away, weighed down by memories. His friend Elaine follows him. Sensing the emotional depth in Paul's reaction, Elaine notices that the film has triggered intense memories, and Paul shares his story, one that reflects the profound human struggles of hope, justice, and redemption. He begins by telling Elaine about his time as a jail guard during the Great Depression, when he was in charge of death row, and one day, a truck carrying a death row prisoner arrived. This moment would forever change his understanding of justice. We meet Paul Edgecombe, groaning in pain due to a urinary tract infection. Despite his personal discomfort, Paul remains the pillar of calm in a chaotic place, supervising officers Brutus Howell, Dean Stanton, Harry Terwilliger, and Percy Wetmore. Brute knocks on the door, informing Paul that a new prisoner has arrived. The prisoner gets off the truck, and Percy, a cruel and arrogant officer, escorts him. Percy yells, "Dead man walking," but his taunts don't unsettle the air of gravity in death row, where every step means something more. As the prisoner enters the block, everyone is amazed by his enormous size. But Paul, a man seasoned in reading people, notices something different. The prisoner, despite his size, carries an innocent expression, something almost childlike in his demeanor. Percy orders the man into the cell with a shove, but Paul swiftly intervenes. Dell, a fellow prisoner, laughs at Percy, provoking him. Percy breaks Dell's hand in retaliation, but Paul puts Percy in his place. Paul reads the prisoner's file and learns that his name is John Coffey. As Paul introduces John to the other guards, John quietly pleads, "Please, don't turn off the lights. I'm afraid of the dark." This small, simple request resonates with Paul. It's a glimpse into the vulnerability that all men, regardless of their circumstances, carry within them. As the cell door closes, John utters the cryptic words, "Tried to take it back, but it was too late," leaving Paul with a sense that there's something more behind John's story. Back at the office, the officers assume John must be slow-witted, but Harry notes that, guilty or not, the crime he's accused of is heinous. They go through John's file, and Paul reads the heartbreaking details. In rural Louisiana, a family's daughters were found dead, and John was discovered holding their bodies, covered in blood. The grieving father, in his rage, beat John before the authorities arrested him. John's only words were, "Tried to take it back, but it was too late." There's a sadness, a mystery, that lingers in those words, a longing for redemption, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of something lost forever. Paul's thoughts are interrupted by the arrival of Hal, the warden, who informs Paul of an angry call from the state capital. Percy, Hal reveals, is well connected as the nephew of the governor's wife. Paul expresses his frustrations with Percy, who has proven time and again that power, when wielded with cruelty, harms everyone around. But Hal advises patience, knowing that Percy is soon to leave for a better-paying job at the Briar Ridge Mental Hospital. Hal hopes that once Percy satisfies his morbid curiosity by witnessing an execution, he will move on. At home, Paul shares his day with his wife. His infection still causes him great discomfort, and he laments how it has distanced him physically from her. But Jan, his devoted wife, responds with kindness, reminding him that love is deeper than the physical. The next day, Paul and Dean clean the electric chair, a tool of final judgment that serves as a grim reminder of their daily duties. Suddenly, they hear Brute laughing in the corner, amused by the appearance of a mouse, which comes out of the isolation cell unafraid. It's a curious sight, this tiny creature, a symbol of life, wandering where death seems to dominate. Brute feeds the mouse a biscuit, and it returns to the isolation cell. Paul, worried that the mouse will cause trouble, orders an officer to catch it. But the mouse seems elusive, evading capture. Even Percy, who later sees the mouse, flies into a rage trying to kill it. Yet the mouse escapes once again, moving calmly through the chaos. As Percy throws objects in anger, Paul steps in to calm him, sensing that the fear Percy spreads among the prisoners only adds to their despair. But Percy's arrogance and cruelty boil over, threatening Brute and the other guards with his influential connections. Later, Paul and the team conduct a rehearsal for an execution. Bitterbuck is the next man scheduled to die, and though the process is grim, Paul ensures it is conducted with as much dignity as possible. Bitterbuck, reflecting on his life, recalls happy memories. It's a bittersweet reminder that even those condemned to die are still human, still filled with dreams and memories. As Bitterbuck is led to the chair, the wet sponge is placed on his head to ensure a quicker, less painful death. Percy, watching from behind a glass, seems detached, almost entertained by the finality of death. After the execution, Percy's cold remark to Bitterbuck's lifeless body, "Send me a card from hell," reveals the darkness within him, a stark contrast to Paul's constant effort to maintain a sense of compassion and humanity. Paul confronts Percy later, learning that Percy's true ambition is to oversee an execution. Paul, despite his disdain for Percy's cruel tendencies, considers allowing him to take Brute's position if he shows improvement. The next morning, the prison is filled with laughter as Dell bonds with the mouse, whom he names Mr. Jingles. It's a small but significant moment of joy, a glimpse of light in a place where shadows often reign. After his conversation with Percy, Paul is called by the warden, Hal, who informs him of a new prisoner arriving soon, William Wharton, sentenced to death for killing 3 people, including a pregnant woman. But there's more weighing heavily on Hal's heart. His wife, Melinda, has been diagnosed with a tumor in her brain, one so large that it's the size of a lemon. The doctors have told him there's nothing they can do, and Hal is devastated by the knowledge that his wife is dying. He confesses to Paul that he hasn't been able to tell her, unable to bear the thought of watching her slip away. That night, Paul's own battle continues. His infection, now almost unbearable, forces him out of bed and into the bathroom. Writhing in pain, he urinates outside, barely able to stand as he lays by the woodpile. Paul knows he needs help, and the next morning he tells Jan that his infection has worsened. But just as Paul prepares to face his own pain, Wharton arrives at the prison. Harry, Dean, and Percy bring the new inmate to the Green Mile, but from the moment he steps foot into the block, it's clear something is wrong. Wharton, drugged and aggressive, lashes out. He elbows Percy in the face and begins strangling Dean with his handcuffs. Paul rushes to help but is incapacitated by a blow to the groin, unable to get a clear shot at Wharton. In a moment of chaos, Paul orders Percy to hit Wharton, but Percy, paralyzed by fear and inaction, does nothing. It's Brutus who steps in, knocking Wharton unconscious with a powerful blow to the head. The guards manage to restrain Wharton and lock him in a cell, but the damage has been done. Paul, in excruciating pain from both his infection and the physical altercation, collapses on the floor. This is where John Coffey, the man everyone believes is a monster, performs a miracle that will forever change the course of Paul's life. Sensing something, John calls Paul to come closer to his cell. Suddenly, John grabs him, pressing hard on Paul's groin. Dell sees this and screams for help, but no one hears him. In the midst of this tension, something extraordinary happens. The light in John's cell glows brightly. John releases Paul, and Paul, coughing out a cloud of gnat-like spores, is left stunned as they disappear into the air. Confused, Paul asks, "What did you do?" John, in his humble way, simply responds, "I helped," before falling into a deep sleep. Still bewildered, Paul goes to the toilet and, to his amazement, his infection is gone. A sense of immense relief washes over him as he realizes something miraculous has taken place. Back home, Paul feels rejuvenated, and for the first time in a while, he is able to reconnect with his wife, both physically and emotionally. It's a reminder that healing doesn't always come in the way we expect, it often comes when we open ourselves to possibilities beyond our control. The next morning, he tells his wife what happened and shares the extraordinary experience with her. Inspired by this miraculous act, Paul knows he must do something for John. Paul calls Brute to take the day off and heads out to meet Bert Hammersmith, John's former public defender. Paul's determination to right this wrong pushes him to seek a new trial for John. Paul begins to realize that perhaps the world isn't always as black and white as it seems, and sometimes redemption lies in the gray spaces. The following day, Paul, as a gesture of appreciation for John's compassion, brings him some cornbread that his wife made. John shares the bread with Dell and Mr. Jingles. Wharton, watching, hopes to receive a piece as well, but John keeps the rest for later, a small act of defiance against the cruelty that surrounds him. Later that day, Wharton attacks Percy, grabbing him from behind and humiliating him until Percy, in a moment of sheer terror, pees himself. Dell, witnessing this, laughs, a brief moment of joy at the expense of Percy's arrogance. But Percy's anger festers, and as punishment, Wharton is placed in an isolation cell. The tension within the Green Mile continues to simmer. The next day, Dell is informed of his impending execution. In a moment of vulnerability, he asks the officers to take care of his beloved mouse, Mr. Jingles, after he's gone. Paul and Brutus, moved by this simple request, promise Dell that they'll take the mouse to the circus, an imagined future that offers Dell a small spark of hope as he faces the end of his life. But this hope is soon shattered. Mr. Jingles runs out of Dell's cell and is cruelly stepped on by Percy, still bitter over the humiliation he faced. Dell is left in shock and despair. In a heart-wrenching act of grace, John steps forward. He asks Paul to bring Mr. Jingles to him. As John blows gently into his hands, the familiar glowing light returns, and the mouse, miraculously, recovers. The guards are left astonished, witnessing an act that defies reason, an act of pure, inexplicable goodness in a place built on death. On a rainy night, the day of Dell's execution arrives. As Dell is seated in the electric chair, Percy, in one last act of cruelty, purposely neglects to wet the sponge that would have made Dell's death swift and painless. Paul, realizing this too late, tries to stop the execution, but Percy quickly signals the officer to lift the lever. The result is horrific. Dell suffers immensely as the electric current courses through him. Wharton, watching from his cell, begins singing, while John, who can feel the pain through a strange connection with Dell, is visibly shaken. Mr. Jingles, sensing the agony, scurries into the isolation cell, as if to hide from the horror unfolding. The audience, shocked by what they're witnessing, is horrified. Brutus, heartbroken by Dell's suffering, asks Paul to turn off the power, but Paul knows that doing so would only prolong Dell's agony. In a final moment of reckoning, Paul forces Percy to look at what he's done. Dell catches fire, and Percy, for the first time, is confronted with the true consequences of his cruelty. After the execution, Percy tries to excuse himself, claiming he didn't know the sponge was supposed to be wet. But Brute, furious, smacks Percy across the face. The warden, filled with anger and frustration, demands answers, and Paul, ever the leader, explains Percy's inexperience and his promise to leave for Briar Ridge after this. Later, as Paul reflects on the day's events, John tells him quietly that he felt all of Dell's pain, and so did Mr. Jingles. It's a haunting reminder of the unseen connections between all of them, that in some ways, we all bear each other's suffering, whether we realize it or not. The next day, Paul and his wife visit Hal and his wife, Melinda. Hal confides in Paul, telling him that Melinda's condition is worsening. She's no longer herself, swearing and dazed, her illness consuming her. That night, Paul tells Jan that he plans to gather the other guards for a dinner at their house, where he hopes to discuss something that might change everything. The following day, Paul presents his plan. He proposes sneaking John out of the prison to Hal's house in hopes that John's miraculous gift might heal Melinda. At first, the other guards are hesitant, fearing the repercussions if they're caught. But Paul's resolve is unshakable. Sometimes, doing the right thing means taking risks. In the end, they agree, and together they make a plan. Paul gives Wharton a drink laced with sleeping pills, ensuring that he won't cause any trouble. They lock Percy in an isolation cell, punishing him for his actions during Dell's execution. Then, with careful precision, they sneak John out of his cell. But just as they're about to leave the Green Mile, a half-drunk Wharton grabs John's arm. In that brief moment of contact, John sees everything, every crime Wharton has committed. Paul, sensing the danger, pulls John away, and they drive to Hal's house. Upon arriving at Hal's house, they are met with hostility as Hal threatens them with a shotgun, mistakenly believing a prison riot or escape is underway. While John heads upstairs to see Melinda, Paul carefully calms Hal down. As John approaches Melinda, something strange happens. An unseen force passes from her mouth to his, causing a brilliant light to fill the room and even creating a small tremor. The connection is broken when John begins to cough violently and collapses. Melinda, now visibly healthier, sits up without any memory of her condition before the incident. Hal, overwhelmed with emotion, collapses in tears, grateful for his wife's recovery. John, however, continues to cough, unable to expel the strange particles as he had done in the past. In gratitude, Melinda gifts him a St. Christopher pendant, a symbol of healing and protection. Back at the prison, John remains visibly weakened by the ordeal. Dean informs the group that Warden is regaining consciousness, prompting them to quickly return John to his cell. Percy, who has just been released from isolation, is fuming. Paul advises him to face the situation like a man, to which Percy grumbles that he will think about it. While some of the others worry that Percy might cause problems later, they know it's an issue they will have to deal with in the future. As Percy walks away, John suddenly grabs him through the bars, pressing their faces together and transferring the strange spores directly into Percy's mouth. Percy, dazed and under John's influence, wanders over to Warden's cell. Warden, now awake, begins mocking Percy once more. With a single tear rolling down his cheek, Percy draws his gun and shoots Warden in the chest. The others rush to Percy's side as he collapses and coughs up the remaining black spores. Paul, shaken by the incident, confronts John, asking why he did this. John explains that both Warden and Percy were evil men and deserved punishment. To show Paul the truth, John offers his hand. Despite the other guards' hesitations, Paul takes John's hand and is flooded with memories that John shares. He sees Warden working on a farm where the two young girls lived. One night, Warden sneaks into their room, abducts them, and threatens them, telling one girl he'll kill the other if she screams. Paul realizes with horror that Warden, not John Coffey, was the true killer of the girls for whose murder John had been wrongfully convicted. After finally letting go, John informs a horrified Paul that it was Warden who killed the girls, driven by their love for each other, a cruel irony that love, something so pure, could lead to such a tragedy. Hal and the cops soon arrive at the mile. Percy, who is now in a delirious state, is evaluated by Hal. Despite the turmoil, Hal tells Paul he will cover for him and the guards, even if it means risking his own career. Paul, loyal to his integrity, denies that anything that occurred at Hal's house is connected to the recent events, protecting Hal from having to shoulder the truth. Percy is ultimately arrested and sent to the same mental institution where he had once aspired to work, a bitter irony. Paul, left with the knowledge of John's innocence, is unsure how to proceed. That night, he confides in his wife, seeking her guidance. With wisdom and quiet strength, she advises Paul to talk to John directly, to understand what he truly wants. The next day, Paul and the other guards sit down with John. They ask him if he would like to escape, to be set free, knowing he is innocent. But John, selfless as ever, declines. He refuses to put them at risk. John knows that freedom is not just a matter of escaping physical walls, it is about inner peace. He has long accepted that his life is entwined with the suffering of others. Paul, grappling with the gravity of the situation, asks John how he can justify going through with his execution when he's innocent, especially in the eyes of God. John, with a serene acceptance, assures Paul not to worry. He explains that he can feel the sorrow of everyone around him, the weight of the world's pain. Living in this constant misery and darkness has worn him down. For John, the execution is not an end but a release. It is an act of mercy, freeing him from the burden of the suffering he has carried for so long. It's a profound realization that sometimes, the greatest act of courage is to let go. Paul, moved by John's grace, asks if he has a final request. John, in his childlike innocence, says he has always wanted to watch a movie. They bring in a projector and play Top Hat, the same film that had brought Paul back to his memories at the beginning of the story. As John watches, mesmerized by Fred Astaire's dance to heaven, there's a quiet understanding that, for John, heaven is not far off now. Finally, the day of John's execution arrives. Paul, deeply conflicted, is forced to take John's pendant but promises to return it to him after his death. As the guards lead John to the execution room, the atmosphere is heavy with animosity from the audience. Among them are the parents of the murdered girls, who hurl insults at John. Brutus, trying to ease John's fear, instructs him to focus on the feelings of the guards, his friends, who stand with him even in this dark moment. It is a poignant reminder that in our final moments, it's the love and compassion of those closest to us that truly matters. The guards are in tears as John is tied to the chair. Paul, knowing John's fear of the dark, cannot bring himself to cover John's face. He double-checks that the sponge is soaked to ensure a quicker death. In a moment of solidarity and respect, Paul steps forward and shakes John's hand. Before issuing the command to turn on the chair, Paul hears John's voice one last time, softly saying, "He killed them with their love." Those words echo in Paul's mind as he places the pendant around his neck. With John's death, Paul and Brutus conclude their time on death row. They are transferred to a youth correctional facility, while the remaining officers continue the work on the Green Mile. Later, Elaine, now aware of Paul's remarkable story, acknowledges how much he has been through. Paul leads Elaine into the woods, where they stumble upon a small cabin. Elaine is astonished to find Mr. Jingles, the little mouse that had been such a symbol of hope, still alive, resting peacefully in a box. In a flashback, Paul recalls returning to the mile shortly after John's execution and discovering the mouse again. Ever since then, Paul had kept Mr. Jingles, a living testament to the inexplicable miracles that surrounded John Coffey. Paul reveals something even more extraordinary: he is now 108 years old. John had infected him with life during their final moments together, just as he had accidentally granted the mouse the gift of longevity when he healed Mr. Jingles. Paul believes this is his punishment for taking part in the execution of what he considers a true miracle of God. He is forced to live, watching everyone he loves grow old and pass away, while he remains, bearing the weight of time. Mr. Jingles' continued life is a reflection of Paul's own seemingly endless journey. Paul has already outlived his friends from the mile, including Hal, Melinda, his wife, and their son. As he stands at Elaine's burial, he wonders how much longer he must carry on. There's a quiet melancholy in his thoughts, but also an acceptance. He knows that one day he will die, and that day will come when it's meant to. But until then, he contemplates how much longer he must wait. If God can keep a mouse alive for so many years, Paul wonders how much longer he will live, carrying the legacy of John Coffey in all that he stood for. The Green Mile is a story that reminds us of the duality of life, light and darkness, love and pain, hope and despair. But above all, it teaches us that even in the dark, there are miracles to be found. John Coffey's story is a reminder that we all have the power to heal, to love, and to make a difference in the lives of others. His death was unjust, but his legacy lives on through the lives he touched. So, as we walk our own mile in life, let us remember that the smallest acts of kindness, the quietest moments of compassion, can carry the greatest weight. Just like John Coffey, we can choose to be a light in a world that sometimes feels dark. And that choice can make all the difference. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more content like this. I think you'll find the next one particularly moving. It's a powerful story of survival, resilience, and the human spirit. Be sure to check it out, you won't want to miss it.